Greetings. My name's Isaac Johnson. I'm a cloud architect, kind of a bent towards DevOps and SRE at Abbott. I'm a Google developer expert, but I came to it by way of the Cloud Innovator Champion program, which has since gone away, but I still think of myself as a Cloud Innovator Champion. I'm an open source advocate, and I'm an active blogger at freshbrew.science. I've been a speaker at places like Open Source North, New Relic user groups, some Datadog meetups. Love to get in front of people and talk. All right, our agenda today. AI tooling. What the heck's an MCP server? So we're going to clear some FUD up there. We're going to look at solving a real problem. We're going to show the development process, at least how I build MCP servers. Then we're going to show how to CI/CD it, how we can share it with others, and then in the real version of this, we'll take some Q&A. All right, what is an MCP server, right? I know I came here by way of, I didn't know what one was, and I thought the only way I can figure this out is to actually make one myself. So the MCP stands for Model Context Protocol, and it came out by way of Anthropic in 2024. I'd say Google, OpenAI, pretty much everybody else adopted it as the standard in this past year. And it supports all the major languages, from Node.js to Typescript to C#, Java, Python, Rust, many others. You can also use Docker to make it even more portable, take away the dependencies issues by using containers. And I'm going to cover a little bit about MCP registries, but they're still a little bit funky today. They're not, a standard universal with the registries. And the whole, this Drake meme comes from the endless retrieval augmentation, where you'd have the old way of doing things would be just endless dump of files locally and try to put it into a general model, which would create huge token usage and cost. So it'd be slow and expensive. And kind of the new model, the way that everybody's adopted it, is called the agentic flow, where an agent kind of works offline, away from you to do the works. And we can have these narrowly defined and controlled tools as served up from MCP. So they end up being specific tools for the job. So far better than having, the AI try to do all the stuff at once. So what is an MCP server made up of? Fundamentally, we have a host, a server, and a tool. These are the three main areas. So in our case, I'll be looking at an AI, a GenAI CLI, like Gemini CLI or Claude Code. But it could be an AI application out there. We can have multiple MCP servers, and the term server here is really loose. Because I think of a server, I tend to think of a computer out there in the wild serving up traffic. When we talk about an MCP server, it could be a Node.js process locally. It could be a Docker file running locally. It could be a server running inside your network. It could be a server running external to your network, somewhere that's serving up a dialogue for the AI tool to use. And really, it kind of comes down to either HTTP using standard web protocols, or standard I/O, which is like a shell session, like you're chatting interactively with it. So these are the two ways we can engage with an MCP server: HTTP and standard I/O. And lastly, you create these tools. So every server advertises, these are the tools I'm offering you, like opening up a toolbox and saying, this one has wrenches or this one has hammers. So like with the Nano Banana MCP server, it can create and describe images. With the Vicunja MCP server, it can list issues or create issues. And one of the nice things here is whether we're talking about a local one or a container, we can pin it to a label. So we can say, I'd like the Nano Banana one at this version of it. And the same thing with the local Docker, I could actually cache my auth. So I can set some environment variables to pass to the container so I don't have to keep typing in my password every time I want to talk to my Vicunja instance. So now we're going to kind of get to the real problem. Like, I want to write an MCP server, but I need to solve a real problem. I don't want to make something that's just never going to be used, some useless tool like a fork made out of a rope, right? So I started down the path of thinking about VLC and maybe playing music, and maybe I'd have tickets out there that would mention a type of music I'd want to listen to when I was doing them. I got kind of hung up with DLLs and trying to engage with the VLC API. It's not very standard. So the other problem I was thinking about solving is I already mentioned the Vicunj MCP. That's my ticketing tool behind the scenes. But all these tools, whether you're talking about Codeberg, Gitea, or Forgejo, they're all kind of based on the same Gitea framework, have ticketing, just like GitHub issues. And so what if I tried to solve that? My next problem was, what language do I use, right? There's so many. There's Node, Python, and there's a lot of things you got to think about when you want to start the process. And I kind of came down to the two most common that I'm comfortable in. Python, which I've done a few of these with Fast MCP. It's a great framework for Python. And Node.js, which is the Model Context Protocol SDK, which you can do with Node, which works with Node.js and Typescript, whether you're doing JavaScript or TypeScript. Now, both have great documentation, and they're easy to containerize. I would argue that when you're thinking about this, if you're not a Node.js person, getting used to the callbacks and the dynamic nature of the code can be a bit of a challenge. But it's got great dependency management. It's very easy to add to package.json. Python is a little bit more procedural in how the code runs. At least as a programmer, it's very easy for me to know step by step by step. But there's a little more challenges with dependencies. How do you do pip install? It's not quite the same. And of course, this all is abstracted if you use Docker. So I started to think, I've done Python a bunch, so I thought, let's do Node. It'll be a good challenge to do Node instead of Python. So the first things we got to do is create a folder. So in here, I'm going to look and see which version of Node. I tend to dance between a lot. So I'll use, at the time of this recording, the current one is LTS-JOD, which is 22. So I'll do LTS-JOD, and then I will make a new directory, and then I'll do npm init. You want to give yourself a name and a version, give a basic description. I tend to skip the code part. I should have said TypeScript, but I did server.js here. So I do the Git repository later, maybe some keywords. And you could choose whatever license you want. I default to MIT, but that's an up to you thing. So now that we've done a Git init, we want to make a branch. I tend to make a main branch, and so that all my code is there. So now you can see I have a package.json. We're at a base. The next step is to create a getignore file. Now you're going to notice here, I did a curl to toptal, which is getignore.io. I've always used getignore.io since like 2017. And it's a great way to just make a quick getignore for Node and Linux to a getignore file. So now when I want to add stuff, it's not going to try to add the node_modules directory. And I bring this up as a lesson learned that if you forget to do a getignore file and you're doing Python with virtual environment, all of a sudden you have a VENV folder added, or if you're doing Node, you got node_modules. Do the getignore before you do anything else, and you'll save yourself some trouble. If you don't, you're gonna have a bad day. All right, next I need a repo to work in. So I'm gonna create a repo in Codeberg. I'm gonna be using Codeberg. Codeberg's kind of a global open source network. I'll talk about that in a moment. But here I've created a repo, and notice the key thing here is don't initialize it because we have a local one I'm gonna push up there. And if you want to share it globally, uncheck the make repository private. So my next steps are to do an install add. I'm just going to trim this up to make it easier to read. So it's basically an npm install of the framework. Then I'm going to add all the files and commit them. I'm going to add my remote origin. I use SSH. You can use HTTP. Up to you. And then I do git push u origin. Now, a lot of the guides will say do just the main branch. I always do -- all. That's my habit, because then I get any local branches I've been working on pushed up to my remote. Just saves me the trouble. So now you can see I have the basic files there up in Codeberg. And a bit note about Codeberg. So Codeberg Eingetragener Verein is in a registered association. It's a non-for-profit registered in Berlin. And it's pretty much the public option, the public SaaS option for Forgejo. I host a Forgejo internally. It was created in 2018 in the EU, largely out of fear for the impacts of the DMCA on free software. And in 2022, there's a little bit of funky business going on with Gitea, which is open source, where there's a commercial side and what stuff was open source, not open source. So they just forked it. So When I say Forgejo, you can just think of a pure open source version of Gitea. And if I say Codeberg, you can imagine the big global hosted instance of Gitea/Forgejo. Hopefully that makes sense. As of 2025, Codeberg had over 300,000 repos and 200,000 users. I think I just saw an update this week that it's now 250,000 users. And as I noted right there, sometimes it goes down. And if you need to engage with them, you got to use chat to Element, or Element's the chat room, but you got to chat over Element to them. Also, they have a pretty strong stance on AI, and they try to keep AI from ever indexing their repos. I'm not going to try to say how I feel one way or the other on that one, but that is a thing with Codeberg, is they will try to prevent AI tools from indexing their code. All right. So I got myself an MCP server, but it's like a tiny burger. It's not really what I wanted, right? It's nothing useful. It's a nothing burger. So let's go ahead and make some code here. So the first thing you're gonna see is I'm gonna make a basic greeting, right? So it's a hello world. It's just gonna repeat back the name. You can see right here, I take a greeting, I ask for a name, I spit it back as hello name. The next part is where I'm running it. I'm gonna be running HTTP streamable. We're gonna talk about standard IO versus streamable at some point here, but HTTP streamable, great for servers, great for running externally. And you can see I'm gonna serve it up on port 3000. So we'll see, here's that same code I just showed you with the imports. I have a greeting, there's the greeting, and the basic server, which has Express, which is really the underlying web server. It hosted on /MCP. And so what I can do is launch it with npx-y tsx server.typescript. And I noted the first time, I tend to use port 3000 for tons of stuff on my computer. So I just made it 3030 here. So it just run on a different port. And then next thing that you can do is you're going to want to use the inspector tool. So I'm not going to open up the server. Instead, I'm going to run the model context protocol /inspector, which you can open into a browser. And from there, I'll bring it over to the screen. We can see, we can now engage with our server, both streamable HTTP and standard IO. You would just set that right here. As soon as we can see it going, I'll see the resources. Now, when we use this tool, the tools, I'll use the word tools more often, will be under resource templates. When I say list templates, what we're gonna get back is the tools. Right now we just have greeting. Now I should have just said my name, right? Because it says hello. So I say hello Devfest.MN, and what is the result gonna be? When I run it, it's gonna say hello, hello Devfest.MN. So it shows that it's working. My MCP server is doing a basic greeting. Hurrah, we've made an MCP server in its most basic fashion functions. But now I want to build something, right? I didn't come here to write a hello world. I wanted to engage with Codeberg. Now I host my own Forgejo internally at Forgejo Fresh Brewed Science. So this is a place where I can do some admin-y stuff for debugging. And so I wanted to use, it's the same protocol, just I'm going to use my local one. And it's got a nice Swagger endpoint. Now I know the new word is Open API. I'm still going to call it Swagger. That's how I grew up. So we're going to call it Swagger. I'm also going to have a little bit of notes on the API usage. When I need to debug things later, it's going to be handy to have the API usage to refer to. So what I'm not going to do to you is make you watch Gemini CLI as I go back and forth with the tool. But I want to talk through what I asked it and show you some of the results. So I said, I have an MCP server that just serves up an echo tool. I want to add a login and get user from Forgejo. The REST API is documented right here. And I give it the URL to that Swagger I just showed you. To test, you may use this with this username and password. So I create a private user so it could engage with the login. And lastly, I always say, any steps it takes to install or use, please add to my README so I can follow that later. So it works, right? It gets a token, but I didn't see any evidence that the token was used in the get user. In fact, it would give me a 403. So I say again, look at the REST API. Let's take a look at that. So it worked,
But then I get a 400. I said, I know the username and password's good. Maybe add some more verbose debug. And then I get another one. It now can't read the properties of undefined, which could be you're on the wrong server URL or you're doing slash. And now I'm getting some errors saying like, it's giving me a 405. I know the username and password's directed. Here's the API. And finally, when my hands were thrown up, I said, can you just make sure to put enough debug out so I could figure it out? So what happened was I started to look through the code, and in doing it test locally, I realized the way Forgejo, Gitea, Codeberg all work is you do a call with basic auth and the name of your token, and provided that name of a token has never been used, it will then generate a new token and give it to you with an authorized session. But if that name's been used, it'll reject it. You've already burned that token unique name. Now you can delete an existing token, but you can't ever retrieve the token. So what the flow ended up needing to be is I need to call to my destination, say, have you used the MCP token? Oh, you have? Well, delete it because I'm going to make a new one. Or if you haven't, just go ahead and create it. So I had to create this flow with the tool, and I had to do it locally to figure it out with curl statements. And it kind of reminds me of a general thing when it comes to any sort of vibe coding or GenAI coding. If at first you don't succeed, try, then stop. No sense in burning all your wallet and tokens, endlessly trying to bang about something that isn't working. Though I think W.C. Fields put it simpler than that. All right, so now you can see what I did. I wrote a very detailed thing to Gemini. I said, hey, there's parts above here you don't see. I tried to get it. When I do it, it works. But if you get one that matches the MCP server by name, then get the ID with it and do a delete command on that ID, and then do this with the curl delete, right? So I give it all the very specific steps. And then it says, okay, it worked. And now the login in the Git tool, now go ahead and add the next ones. Add a search, add a create. And this is how I started to iterate by adding additional tools to my MCP server, is pointing out each specific thing. And I do about 2 or 3 at a time. Another lesson learned with the AI tools is don't put too much on them. Do little steps, check your code in, validate it. That's the best way. All right. So now I've got a bunch of tools, and I said, I'd like to add the README to reflect all the tools that are there. And I said, again, reference the Swagger. So at this point, what I have is a pretty good basic one on one side, and then one that I did in JavaScript on the other side. So I needed to start to merge my 2 pieces of work, because obviously I wrote this presentation before I am doing it now. So I had to kind of go back and forth with converting it. One of the things I want to talk about how I did that. So I'd already talked about using Gemini CLI, which is fantastic. But I wanted to use VS Code, and I have not had the best luck with Gemini Code Assist. Nothing wrong with GCA, just GCA and I don't get along. So one of the ways I do this is with the Continue Dev plugin. Now, Continue Dev is a company that has their own AI hosting. Nothing wrong with it. Their prices are fine. But I like their plugin a lot, because when you look at their plugin, they have a config JSON. And if we look at this config JSON, what you're going to see is there are times that I'm using it for an Azure AI Foundry hosted thing. And this is a system message I borrowed from a friend that says, you're a college professor. I have a history of kind of knowing how the code works. Please teach me something. So I use that basic GPT 4.0 to just teach myself stuff on topics I want. I have Gemini 2.5 Pro preview. I was using it in the preview mode, 2.5 Pro now. And quite literally, in the time it's taken me to develop this presentation for you, Gemini 3 has released. So I now have a block in my new one for Gemini 3. You'll also notice here in mine, my local tab complete uses a locally hosted Olama that's using a basic Quinn 2.5 coder. Basic, because it's just tab complete. I don't burn any tokens, and I just run it against an Olama running on a basic Ryzen 9 Linux box. All right, so what did I do? I told it,
fix the wrong password issue I have. The user didn't have right. So actually, I'm jumping ahead of myself. Let's go take a view of some of that. We're going to see that the details, I made sure to check to see the output had the password. That's how I figured out the password was wrong. And then I could watch the process of the code going into the browser here. All right. The other thing I want to point out with that continue dev is that when you're using it, and I will get to showing you what I just talked about with the password and the flow, is continue dev is using the Vertex AI that hosts Gemini, and I found it is phenomenally cheap to use. And so this whole thing cost me, by my numbers, about 5 cents to do all these fixes. All right, so let's get to the code. What you can see here is basically I have created the MCP, right, in one folder. So you can see I have both of mine cloned out here. So you see Forgejo MCP, that's the JavaScript. This is the Typescript. And I'm going to try to ask it to bring in the tools I developed in JavaScript to the Typescript. And this is passing up through continue dev back to Vertex AI to do the work. Now, I absolutely could have done this with Gemini or Anti-Gravity or a myriad of other tools, but now I'm doing it through here. So it starts to go down the path of developing it. I'm not going to make you watch all this because it can get a little long. But the npm installs, it doesn't always work through here, so I just ran the command it asked to run. So now we get going. And now it's doing all the imports and switching it over. Now with the changes here, I still need to go through and accept. So unlike the agentic flow, this is more of an interactive dialogue. I'm popping through here and hitting accept on these. Actually, it is agentic, but it still requires me to hit accept. I got all the documentation in here. So I'm going to run inspector. Now the whole reason this is taking forever is for a moment I forgot to do the nvm use lts-jod. So now let's get this session up. Let's test it. This is after I just migrated it with Gemini 2.5. I wasn't even using 3. And first test to see if it works. So we'll do this code, and all of a sudden I do see all the additional ones. It's not just login and get user. I got search issues, all the ones I developed. Now the first problem I had here was the password is wrong. And so I'm getting an error on my tool call. And that was where I went back to that session to debug it to say, why am I getting a 401 unauthorized? So I go to Forgejo, I reset the password to make sure I have the right password. And now I log in and I get success. We're now logging into the session without any issues. So now I'm going to get user. Don't worry, I realize I just typed the password in 1 second. I got to do the test user or test MCP user. So now I get the test MCP user. I can see the details. That tells me we're engaging with the Forgejo instance without any trouble. It's getting the user and its details. So let's do a new tool call. So we're going to create issue here. So my first place I thought to do it was in the builder admin Forgejo MCP repo. Well, I'm not sure if you're catching on to what the problem is. I'll give you one moment. Don't worry, I'll tell you as soon as this test runs. It's not going to work. But do you know why? Give it a body. It doesn't work. You had enough time. It doesn't work because that's the builder admin repo. That is a different user's repo, private repo. And I've been using the test user to log in. So it took me a moment to figure out, oh, I can't do it because the test user can't see that one. So let me do the public project. All my users can see the public project. I also could have done a private project in the test MCP user space. Now we have a public project. And and we can see it create an issue. Let's go refresh. There's a test issue. So now we're getting our tickets created into Forgejo exactly how we wanted to, using our MCP server. Obviously, we're engaging with it locally with the MCP tool. All right. So my next step is, I mean, the inspector is great, but I actually want to use this thing, right? So let's use the Gemini CLI to remove some hard-code instances. Throughout my code, I hard-coded Forgejo MCP. So I'm going to go ahead and say, let's externalize that as a parameter. I'll use Gemini CLI to do it. We can see the code here. It's switching it up to an instance I'm going to pass. I'm going to go ahead and launch this with the inspector. And now the key thing to notice here is you notice that the instance right here is something I can type in, right? So now I can test with Gemini CLI. I do an npm add user and an npm publish. Oh, this is adding to the registry. So I need to first publish. This is the whole thing with MCP registry. All right, this might be a rant. First, you got to add it to an npm registry, which in its own problem is a challenge. But you get it into the MCP registry after authenticating a new npm user and all that process. And I see it as a package, but then I got to do it to the registry behind the scenes. Now, on the side here, I had the thought that let's just make a Docker file now. I think I'm going to need it later. So I made a Docker file to host this thing just from a dependency management standpoint. And in doing so, it's easy to create it for portability. You know, I can set a user port that can be overwritten, and it's just a fallback in case this npm approach fails. So I test that Docker run, and it works, and I can see my server. But what it wasn't working is the npx. And the reason the npx wasn't working, it's not an I believe. I've tested this since. You can't do the HTTP as a local Docker. I can do it as an external Docker. I can run Docker and talk to it, but the HTTP streamable assumes that it's running somewhere else. So now I got Docker run. It's running on a port, and I'm going to test it with Copilot now. So the key thing with Copilot here is we're going to see we're going to see that I have it fired up. And we can do edit, and then what we do is an HTTP. We can then put in our server. So here I'm going to run it on localhost 3030. And it gives it like a random name, so you got to change that to something else. So I give it a better name. And by the way, if you're running in Windows subsystem for Linux, make sure you say remote. If you don't, it'll try to run a Linux process on Windows, and it never really works very well. I already know it's working. And the way I know it works is, see how it says 6 tools there? That is a clear indicator this guy is actually running and talking. If we didn't have that number of tools, things would be not going. Now we can see output that it is seeing while talking to the tool. Well, my next step is to actually use it. So I'm going to say, I'll be really explicit, use the my Node.js MCP server, log in to my server. I give it the exact URL, Forgejo, with a username and password. So this should detect the login tools, what I'm asking for, and pass the right parameters of demo MCP and Devfest.MN. Then I say, I'm going to be a little bit more. I'm going to say, show me the issues in the project. And I'll say the public repo project. And my goal here is to prove the agentic flow within Copilot can use the MCP server just like Gemini CLI. So it thanks. In a moment, it's going to say, hey, do you want to use that tool you provided me? So then I say, yeah, go ahead. Now, I don't know if you caught the mistake there. I certainly didn't when it first went. But it's going to try to log in. And we're going to get errors. Pass it again. Are you seeing the error? I can now that I think about it. I say login. What's wrong? Right? It's not working, right? I know it's working. I try resetting the password. But it keeps telling me it's not working. I know it's working, right? The problem is that it kept adding HTTP. I do that already. So in the behind the scenes, I was getting http://http://Forgejo. Now I could have either made my MCP server more robust, or what I will do here is I'm going to say really explicitly, log into this server and don't add the HTTP, and I think I even put it in double quotes. Say, do not add, because the AI tools are just doing their best to be clever, right? They're token completion. They're trying to figure out what the right approach is. And so it thought, well, he must have meant to type HTTP because it is a server. But I don't want HTTP in there. So now I make it really clear. Hit go. We're going to see and allow. And now the instance shows right. It's without the HTTP. The login is fine. It then goes and says, do you want to run list issues? Yes, I do. And now I get all the issues back from the server, which was exactly what my goal was. And to prove that this is working, we're not only going to do list issues. Let's try to create a new issue from within Copilot. Again, our goal here is to kind of prove that multiple GenAI tools are working with our system. So go ahead, doing a code, hit allow. And now it tells me, but the best way to do it is to validate yourself. So let's open up a browser, and we're going to go ahead and look at the project and see, indeed, there's the demo from Copilot. So we are now working with both Gemini CLI and Copilot. So at this point, what we've done is we've stashed our code up to Codeberg, and we're running things locally in Docker. And behind the scenes, I'm also occasionally storing the image in Docker Hub, so it's not dependent on my local computer. But I don't need to. I don't even need this extra line here. Let's talk about the MCP registry. So it took me forever to figure out the protocol. The MCP registry doesn't tell you. The documentation is terrible. You need a elliptical curve type of key that is set to exactly P384 or nothing works. And I kept trying everything in GSM and AKV to make this work. Luckily, the AKV gave me the better error to tell me about what kind of protocol it wanted. So once I figured out the type of key, there was elliptic curve P384 key with a SHA-384 digest, then I could authenticate my private domain. Now, this doesn't apply to you if you're using GitHub. GitHub will authenticate for you, but I'm trying to authenticate as steeped.icu. Then once I do it, it says, your Python package needs to have these, your node package that you're trying to publish to the registry needs to have a few key names, like the actual server and a few others. And every time it tells you an error, you need to republish the NPM registry, and then you could go back and try to re-add to the other registry. So once I have logged in, and the KMS login is real short-lived, and I've logged in, I can now see the key. And to log in, you got to log in and then add the text record at the root level that matches what they want right here for the expected proof record, and then you can say that you're logged in on your own private domain right here. So there's my proof record. I had to create a text record in Google DNS, Cloud DNS, and then I could authenticate as my own domain. And then once I published it, I could publish it, but then I realized it was just taking it in as standard IO. And that was, I think I eventually did solve it for HTTP streamable, but I was just getting more and more annoyed by that. And I'll show you kind of that process of logging in. So here you can see I've made a change. I go from 102 to 103.
I always feel like you need to iterate your versions. I switch it over from standard I/O to streamable HTTP because that is the right approach. Now I can do an npm publish. This publishes it to the npm registry, so now it's got set to streamable, and so it should work. And now I gotta do an MCP publisher login because it only lasts for a few moments. So I give this exact key to the GSM, and I'm gonna fast forward because I typo that first one. You can always get resource name, so you're not hand typing, which is what I should have done in the first place. So then I log in with my key. Obviously I've done an auth login behind the scenes so I can see that key. Now I've logged in with that key, I can do the MCP publisher, and this will then publish the version matching 103, and now I'm in the registry. And you could use curl to see you're in the registry. But even to this day, I really couldn't tell you exactly how to use it, except maybe when you do the npx thing, it finds it. But it's a little unclear to me how you're supposed to use your registry. So now it's there in the registry. So now I want to do a build. I need code to be doing automatic. I don't want to do things by hand. The goal is to use CI/CD to build and push our code in a reliable, repeatable way, right? So it's going to take our code and push it out for the final images. So I'm going to need to create a Codeberg runner. Now, again, this is where GitHub would have been easier, but I'm trying to hold it to an open source line. I'm trying to use Gitea, Codeberg. So when I none of these runners would really work with Kaneko or with Docker builds. So I added my own runner with a token. And so then once that is up and running locally on a Linux box, then I can log in and register it. This is just following the same steps for adding a runner. So now I have a runner running locally that has Docker and Docker. And so now my build uses Kaneko, which also doesn't require a privileged container. And so I'm going to do Kaneko. What you're going to notice here is I'm going to push to two places. I'm going to push over to Docker Hub and to my own private Harbor container registry. So there's the build. And now you can see that it's being hosted and available for everybody in the world in Docker Hub. But it's also in my public endpoint for my private Harbor CR, so it's hosted out of my server farm in the house. So at this point, pause. What we got going on here is we have our Git repos in Codeberg, and as we can see here, our builds are on that Linux host and pushing up to Docker Hub, as well as my Harbor CR, and I can run them locally in Docker. And if you ask, because we are in DevFest, Isaac, why not use Cloud Build, right? Well, my problem with Cloud Build is twofold. My problem with Cloud Build is that it only supports GitHub, GitLab, and Bitbucket. And I've raised this a few times, in that you gotta let me have arbitrary Git locations, because I don't always want to use the biggest providers. And Codeberg or any Git that I have should really be available. There's nothing magical about just these providers. So I can't use Cloud Build specifically because they don't support Codeberg or Gitea or Forgejo. The other thing I was going to say, because I was going to say two things. Isaac, why not use GAR? The cost of Google Artifact Registry really skyrockets when you start to push a lot of bits. And each one of these container images is about 503 megs. So as a result, I don't really want to run things in GAR because it's going to cost me a bunch. And so what you're going to see here is I try to push and use my own private registry, and it's like, no, you must use either GCR or GitHub's registry or Docker Hub. And I just feel like, why? I have a Harbor. You could have pulled my Docker image. So instead I use Docker Hub. It's fine. It just, sometimes there's these limits that I don't think make a lot of sense to me. And it frustrates me. But it's pulling latest. It's the same image as my Harbor. And now what we're going to see is in deploying to Cloud Run Service,
it's going to create a revision, but it's also going to create all the networking bits I needed to do. So I have said make it public. In fact, shoot, I shouldn't have fast forward there. When I am doing this, I said to make it public. So I said, please allow public URLs in there. And you need to make sure you catch that option when you're doing the cloud deploy. So next, I want to try running it. So now here's my Gemini CLI settings. I took that URL that just came out of Cloud Run, and I put it into my Gemini settings, and I see the Forgejo is up and running, which is fantastic. So now I'm using a serverless endpoint, which is very cost effective. Cloud Run is very cheap. So Cloud Run is hosting up my URL with HTTPS, so I feel okay passing a password to it, and I'm able to engage with it to talk to Forgejo in a reliable way. The only thing I'm going to point out is the URL that comes back here that you see from Cloud Run adds /MCP because we're serving it up on an MCP sub area. Don't worry about the port. Cloud Run took care of that. So where are we at? At this point, we have moved from having something that's going to Docker Hub and serving locally to going ahead and creating a GCP Cloud Run and hosting it there. All right. The next thing I'm going to talk about is Gemini CLI extensions. So one of the things I love about Gemini CLI is they make it really easy to add things just as an extension, so my users don't need to know how to mess with the settings JSON. So what you do here is you create a Gemini CLI extensions file, and you add it in the subfolder here, and then you can go ahead and see I blasted away the entry that was in my global one. I can do Gemini CLI extensions link here, which says go ahead and link it to my local, and when I fire up Gemini CLI, this is being served up from the link to that settings file. When I do Gemini CLI extensions link, my second thing is I can see the source. The source for some of these are URLs. The source for mine is a local. So we go ahead and add that and push it to our repo. Sorry, push it to our repo. And then you see that right now I have Vikunja and Nano Banana, but not the new one, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add that URL. It does like HTTP, so you can do Gemini extensions install, the URL, and now this is awesome. I could put this into my README documentation on my website, say to use my CLI tool, just run this Gemini extensions install command. That's it. The user needs to know nothing else. What's happening behind the scenes is it's going to go ahead and pull it down. It's going to run Docker. It's already got the URL to my Cloud Run. When I do extensions list, you see it's running right now. And if I say Gemini and launch, it's going to fire up that server to talk to the Docker container on HTTP Streamable. And my user, you can see there's 3 servers. So when I say MCP list, this is now installed and run through the Gemini CLI extensions. Now, where I'd like to go is I'd love to see it here. But you know why I can't see it here? They only index GitHub. So again, another one of those little just nitpicky things. Let me add things that aren't GitHub for my URLs. And the way I got my Vikunja one in here is I begrudgingly synced my Forgejo public repo to GitHub just so it could get picked up. And then it got picked up. So one of my next steps would be to move this from Cloud Run to an internal K8 so I can have better control. And I might want to add open telemetry for metrics collection so I can see who's using it, like how often, right? And I'll probably add some PR rules and the contributing MDs, and I'll probably add something that would trigger a notification to me when people add issues so that I'm not having to watch a Git repo. So these are all kind of next steps that I'd like to do. And this is kind of what the making a Docker file for or making a Kubernetes YAML manifest would be super easy. Basically a service and a deployment, and then you could do an ingress on your own. It's that easy to do it in Kubernetes. Lastly, I was going to take some Q&A, right? And thank you for your time. I will, because you've stayed with the video this long, showed you that some of the things I've done since I did this presentation the first time is I added unit tests across the board for all the code, and then I went ahead and I switched it to standard IO, so that I have a version now that can be run with just MPX. I had to update all my documentation for it, but now for my users, I have things that run both as HTTP streamable and standard IO, so I kind of cover both worlds. Thank you for your time, and thank you for watching all this.